All right, let's get started. This will be our last week, be kind of completing the arc on modernism, we might say, but also on the Marxist approaches to critical theory of the relationship between art and capitalism. So next time we will be moving into postmodernism. So the main readings that we have are Michael Fried, who we've read previously in a debate with T.J. Clark over Clement Greenberg's legacy. So his famous art critical piece, Art and Objecthood, from the late 60s. We also then have from the 1970s Danielle Bell on modernism and capitalism. And we have Rosalind Krauss, who is one of the founding editors of the October Art Journal. We have not only her statement about the October Journal, but also her substantial essay, Sculpture and the Expanded Field. So we'll be thinking about Fried's Art and Objecthood and Krauss's Sculpture in the Expanded Field, since Fried is doing a critique, a criticism really of minimalist sculpture. So those two readings are tied together, and Modernism and Capitalism by Danielle Bell and Rosalind Krauss's editorial statement about October are also in relation to each other. Any volunteers to take the lead on posting discussion notes next time? Okay, you guys? All right, thank you. Okay, so we have a fair amount of material to get through today. In some ways, we're going to be not only rounding out the first part of the syllabus, but also last week's readings from the Arcades Project. So I think that I mentioned that Benjamin's Arcades Project, this was his main focus from starting in the late 1920s, but certainly throughout the 1930s. And he took some time off, wrote some side projects, for instance, the work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction that we read. Was sort of written in parallel to the work that he was doing on the Arcades Project, which he never finished. He never wrote his book on the Arcades Project, but he did write these pieces that we've read, namely The Paris of the Second Empire and Baudelaire. We've also had some of his notes from the convolutes, or the folders, to the project. So it's kind of bibliographical notes. Now, the main reading that we have for today is his draft of a historiographic introduction, a methodological introduction as a historian on the Arcades Project. So usually a work of history, a history book, has an opening chapter that explains how the historian is going to be writing about history. So cluing in the reader as to the method adopted by the historian. So it's a kind of very peculiar piece with respect to this. As a historiographic introduction, it's kind of far-ranging and also a little bit obscure. But it helps to keep in mind that it is the introduction to the Arcades Project, because it explains some of his specific historical references that he makes here. And I think that we talked a little bit about this last week, how Benjamin was finding the 20th century foreshadowed or kind of prefigured in the 19th century. So the 19th century kind of gave us one run of events that seem to be repeating in the 20th century, specifically 1848, specifically the aftermath of the 1848 revolutions. So think about our kind of general history. What we have in the background, not only 1789, but also 1830. We have the events of the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune. which was the immediate backdrop for Nietzsche's use and abuse of history for life. So we'll see. And we have World War I and the revolutions that followed. And then finally we have Great Depression, the Nazi seizure of power, and then World War II, which began pretty early in 1936. So I don't know if we talked about this very much. We must have, with the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, the epilogue, where Benjamin cites the Italian futurists in the context of the Ethiopia War. So Mussolini's Italy invaded Libya and Ethiopia, trying to reestablish the Roman Empire control over the Mediterranean. So Italy invaded Libya and Ethiopia. Japan expanded its military operations in China, and the Spanish Civil War took place in 1936 as well. So those are the opening shots of World War II. The Spanish Civil War is also something that the British and the French and the Americans stay out of, but fascist Italy and Nazi Germany take active part in helping Franco's fascists put down the Republic, which was supported by the communists and the anarchists. Okay, so Benjamin died in 1940 fleeing the Nazis after they invaded France. So Benjamin had been living in France after the Nazi seizure of power. He had spent time in various parts of Western Europe, but was living primarily in France and Paris. And he was detained at the border of Spain trying to escape, and he was afraid he was going to be taken back to France and put in the hands of the Nazis, so he killed himself. He came prepared to do that. He had a overdose amount of heroin, I think is what he used, not morphine. It was heroin. He had left his papers in the care of Georges Bataille, one of the Surrealists, who then gave it to Adorno in his papers that he had left with Bataille to Adorno after World War II. And they were able to publish the Arcades Project. However, this methodological introduction already got out. So this draft of the concept of history got out, and so it was published by the Frankfurt School early on during World War II. Okay, so I wanted to start with just a sort of callback to Baudelaire, and then forward to Brecht. We have two poems, or we have one aphorism by Baudelaire and one poem by Brecht. I'm going to set the stage for what Benjamin is dealing with in the 20th century. If we just bear in mind that the Second Empire of Bonapartism as the aftermath of 1848 revolution and fascism and Nazism as a kind of aftermath to the revolutions after World War I. We read Wilhelm Reich earlier in the semester, Ideology as Material Power, and he addressed what he called the subjective factor in history. namely that the Marxists, the vulgar Marxists at the time, expected the Great Depression to bring about a socialist revolution. Instead, it brought about the Nazis coming to power. Here's Baudelaire. This is some late writing of Baudelaire. Some aphorisms that he wrote under the provisional title. They're published posthumously. The Fusées, or rockets. Influential for Nietzsche, in fact. The world is drawing to an end. Only for one reason can it last longer, just because it happens to exist. Suppose it should continue materially, would that be an existence worthy of its name in the historical dictionary? I do not say that the world will be reduced to expedience and the buffoonish disorder of the republics of South America, that perhaps even we shall return to a savage state, and that we will go through the grassy ruins of our civilization to seek our grazing ground rifle in hand. No. Because such adventures would still suppose a certain vital energy, echo of first ages. We shall furnish a new example of the inexorability of the spiritual and moral laws, and shall be their victims. We shall perish by the very thing by which we fancy that we live. Technocracy will Americanize us. Progress will starve our spirituality so far that nothing of the bloodthirsty, sacrilegious, or unnatural dreams of the utopists will be comparable to such positive results. Universal ruin will manifest itself not solely or particularly in political institutions or general progress or whatever else might be a proper name for it. It will be seen above all in the baseness of hearts. Pretty accurate forecast. Here's Brecht, who was a personal acquaintance of Benjamin. We saw that Benjamin made reference to Brecht in a couple of writings that we read, the author as producer, as well as the experience of poverty. So here's Brecht. To posterity. Indeed, I live in the Dark Ages. A guileless word is an absurdity. A smooth forehead betokens a hard heart. He who laughs has not yet heard the terrible tidings. Ah, what an age it is when to speak of trees is almost a crime, for it is a kind of silence about injustice. And he who walks calmly across the street, is he not out of reach of his friends in trouble? It is true I earn my living, but believe me, it is only an accident. Nothing that I do entitles me to eat my fill. By chance I was spared. If my luck leaves me, I am lost. They tell me, eat and drink, be glad you have it. But how can I eat and drink when my food is snatched from the hungry and my glass of water belongs to the thirsty? And yet I eat and drink. I would gladly be wise. The old books tell us what wisdom is. Avoid the strife of the world. Live out your little time, fearing no one, using no violence, returning good for evil. Not fulfillment of desire, but forgetfulness passes for wisdom. I can do none of this. Indeed, I live in the Dark Ages. I came to the cities in a time of disorder, when hunger ruled. I came among men in a time of uprising, and I revolted with them. So the time passed away which on earth was given me. I ate my food between massacres. The shadow of murder lay upon my sleep. And what I loved with indifference. I looked upon nature with impatience. So the time passed away which on earth was given me. In my time, streets led to the quicksand. Speech betrayed me to the slaughterer. There was little I could do, but without me, the rulers would have been more secure. This was my hope. So the time passed away which on earth was given me. You, who shall emerge from the flood in which we are sinking, think, when you speak of our weaknesses, also of the dark time that brought them forth. For we went changing our country more often than our shoes. in the class war, despairing, when there was only injustice and no resistance. For we knew only too well, even the hatred of squalor makes the brow grow stern. Even anger against injustice makes the voice grow harsh. Alas, we, who wished to lay the foundations of kindness, could not ourselves be kind. But you, when at last it comes to pass that man can help his fellow man, do not judge us too harshly. Start with a short piece by Nietzsche, and this will also help us anticipate some things from the postmodernism that we'll be addressing in the future, in coming weeks. Early Nietzsche piece, we're looking at two pieces by Nietzsche that are by the young Nietzsche. This is just an excerpt from On Truth and Lie in an Extra-Moral Sense. And then we will look at the use and abuse of history for life. So, truth and lie in an extra-moral sense. So the first thing that we should notice is the implicit dialogue with Kant on this. So we talked about Kant early in the semester. Kant's philosophy, his critical philosophy derived from the true, the good, and the beautiful. Now, what did Kant register about modernity? We read Robert Pippin the first week of class, and he said that modernity and the motivation for critical philosophy can be traced to what he called the Kantian aftermath. So for the ancients, the true, the good, and the beautiful are in many respects aspects of the same thing. They're eternal values, they're virtues. Whereas for modern people, we understand that the true, the good, and the beautiful change. Yet Kant's point was that the fact that the truth changes, or that morality, the good, changes, or that our aesthetic response to things, our experience of things, the beautiful, changes, doesn't invalidate those categories, because those categories are not about eternal external principles, but rather about our subjectivity, and indeed the freedom that our subjectivity expresses. And it's our freedom that causes the truth to change, our notions of moral goodness to change, and our aesthetic sensibility to change. So Nietzsche's registering this as well, separating morality from truth. But not just truth, lying. So not just error, but we could say deliberate or intentional at least, falsehood. So let's see what Nietzsche has to say. In some remote corner of the universe, poured out and glittering in innumerable solar systems, there once was a star on which clever animals invented knowledge. That was the haughtiest and most mendacious minute of world history. Yet only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star grew cold, and the clever animals had to die. Okay, so whose perspective is this told from? It's a very strange perspective on humanity, isn't it? One thing that Nietzsche does is that he does the reverse of anthropomorphism. So anthropomorphism is giving human qualities to animals. He habitually gives animal attributes to humans, kind of zoomorphism. But anyway, this perspective would seem to predate humanity and postdate humanity. It's what we imagine a kind of God's eye view on ourselves would be. Or we could put it, we could substitute for God sort of objective nature. That would still ultimately be God's eye view. And yet it's our own view, meaning we have a view on ourselves above and outside of history, seemingly. Okay, so he goes on, one might invent such a fable and still not have illustrated sufficiently how wretched, how shadowy and flighty, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect appears in nature. There have been eternities when it did not exist, and when it is done for again, nothing will have happened. For this intellect has no further mission that would lead beyond human life. It is human, rather, and only its owner and producer gives it such importance, as if the world pivoted around it. But if we could communicate with the mosquito, then we would learn that it floats through the air with the same self-importance, feeling within itself the flying center of the world. There is nothing in nature so despicable or insignificant that it cannot immediately be blown up like a bag by a slight breath of this power of knowledge. And just as every porter wants an admirer, the proudest human being, the philosopher, thinks that he sees the eyes of the universe telescopically focused from all sides on his actions and thoughts. It is strange that this should be the effect of the intellect, for after all, it was given only as aid to the most unfortunate, most delicate, most evanescent beings in order to hold them for a minute in existence, and which otherwise, without this gift, it would have had every reason to flee as quickly as lessened sun. That haughtiness, which goes with knowledge and feeling, which shrouds the eyes and senses of man in a blinding fog, therefore deceives him about the value of existence by carrying in itself the most flattering evaluation of knowledge itself. Its most universal effect is deception, but even its most particular effects have something of the same character. I'm going to jump ahead to the last part of this. Only through forgetfulness can man ever achieve the illusion of possessing a truth in the sense just designated. If he does not wish to be satisfied with truth in the form of a tautology, that is, with empty shells, then he will forever buy illusions for truths. What is a word? The image of a nerve stimulus it sounds. But to infer from the nerve stimulus a cause outside us, that is already the result of a false and unjustified application of the principle of reason. The different languages set side by side show that what matters with words is never the truth, never an adequate expression, else there would not be so many languages. The thing in itself, for that is what pure truth without consequences would be, is quite incomprehensible to the creators of language, and not at all worth aiming for. One designates only the relations of things to man, and to express them, one calls on the boldest metaphors. A nerve stimulus first transposed into an image, first metaphor. The image, in turn, imitated by a sound, second metaphor. Let us still give special consideration to the formation of concepts. Every word immediately becomes a concept, inasmuch as it is not intended to serve as a reminder of the unique and wholly individualized original experience to which it owes its birth, but must at the same time fit innumerable more or less similar cases, which means, strictly speaking, never equal. In other words, a lot of unequal cases. Every concept originates through our equating what is unequal. No leaf ever wholly equals another, and the concept leaf is formed through an arbitrary abstraction from these individual differences, through forgetting the distinctions. And now it gives rise to the idea that in nature there might be something besides the leaves, which would be leaf, some kind of original form after which all leaves have been woven, marked, copied, colored, curled, and painted, but by unskilled hands, so that no copy turned out to be a correct, reliable, and faithful image of the original form. We call a person honest. Why did he act so honestly today, we ask? Our answer usually sounds like this: because of his honesty. Honesty. That is to say, again, the leaf is the cause of the leaves. After all, we know nothing of an essence-like quality named honesty, We know only numerous individualized and thus unequal actions, which we equate by omitting the unequal and by then calling them honest actions. In the end, we distill from them a occult quality with the name of honesty. What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations, which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are. Metaphors, which are worn out and without sensuous power. Coins, which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal no longer as coins. We still do not know where the urge for truth comes from, for as yet we have heard only of the obligation imposed by society that it should exist. To be truthful means using the customary metaphors. In moral terms, the obligation to lie according to fixed convention. To lie herd-like in a style obligatory for all. So that's going to give us the spirit of postmodernism to a certain extent. The postmodernists think of themselves as Nietzschean. Heidegger was a Nietzschean. Heidegger inspired the French fries, Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, especially the early Nietzsche exercises them. So this is where we get the pluralization of everything. So there's no leaf, there are only leaves. There's no feminism, there are only feminisms. Right, the pluralization of everything. That's like taken directly from this idea. Anti-metaphysics. So again, he agrees with Kant, we might say, and agrees with Marx, we might say. He was ignorant of Marx. But he agrees that metaphysical categories like honesty, or like the concept of leaf per se, a metaphysical object, is a function of our subjectivity. Meaning it's about the subject. It isn't really about the object or about the world or things in themselves. The main thing that we read from Nietzsche for this week is the use and abuse of history for life. We're not going to be able to deal with this exhaustively. We really are going to try to set it up as the background for Benjamin's on the concept of history. So before Benjamin was converted to Marxism from reading Georg Lukács, reading History and Class Consciousness, reading that essay from which we read on reification and the consciousness of the proletariat, before that, Benjamin was a Nietzschean. And so we will see that he attempts a kind of Marxist appropriation of Nietzsche and a kind of symptomatic treatment of Nietzsche. What kind of a symptom is this Nietzschean sense of history from the late 19th century? That appears to be the opposite of Hegel's concept of history. So Hegel's philosophy of history, Hegel's concept of history. Hegel defined history as progress in consciousness of freedom. And he likewise said that there are times and places without history, because not all times and places participate in the progress in consciousness of freedom. So there are blank pages in the past. Let's say something about this with regard to history, if I may, at this point. I'm not sure that we've covered this before, but we normally think of history and time erroneously as a line connecting past, present, and future. But that's not quite right. So it's not a linear function of past, present, future. Rather, I was thinking of Drake meme when I do this. The Drake meme. So, history, first of all, is not the past. History is what the past means to us. History is how the past impacts us, its significance to us. So history is a relation between the present and the past. Faulkner, American writer, wrote famously, "The past is not dead, it's not even past." What do you mean by that? The past continues to act. And everything that exists, everything in the present, everything that is the continued action of the past. So history is the relation and also the interaction of the past and the present. So the past continues to act, and then in the present we interact with that past action. And it's out of that interaction that the future is generated. Now we have an introduction to, so I don't know if we did this earlier in the course, I don't think we did. We have an introduction to Nietzsche by a more contemporary philosophy scholar, Peter Preuss. And he's got a nice way of summarizing Nietzsche and calling attention to what the agenda of Nietzsche is. So here's Peter Preuss. Man, unlike animal, is self-conscious. He is aware that he is alive and that he must die. And because he is self-conscious, he is not only aware of living, but of living well or badly. Life is not wholly something that happens to man. It is also something he engages in according to values he follows. Human existence is a task. Whatever a person does finally receives its meaning only so far as it is integrated into the total task of existing. If it fails to further this task, it is valueless. If it hinders this task, it is to be rejected. The quest for knowledge and truth is also a part of the task of existing. And like every human enterprise, it receives its value from being integrated into the task of which it is part. The 19th century had discovered history, and all subsequent inquiry and education bore the stamp of this discovery. This was not simply the discovery of a set of facts about the past, but the discovery of the historicity of man. Man, unlike animal, is a historical being. Man is not wholly the product of an alien act, either natural or divine, but in part produces his own being. The task of existing is a task precisely because it is not a case of acting according to a permanent nature or essence, but rather of producing that nature within the limitations of the situation. History is the record of this self-production. It is the activity of a historical being recovering the past into the present, which anticipates the future. With a total absence of this activity, man would fall short of humanity. History is necessary. But what if this activity is perverted? What if, rather than remaining the life-promoting activity of a historical being, history is turned into the objective uncovering of mere facts by the disinterested scholar? Facts to be left as they are found, to be contemplated without being assimilated into present being. According to Nietzsche, this perversion has taken place, and history, rather than promoting life, has become deadly. This then is the dilemma Nietzsche faced. History is necessary, but as it is practiced, it is deadly. The present work, this use and abuse of history for life by Nietzsche, is an attempt to extricate himself and us from this dilemma. Okay, so what's being described here is historicism, what Benjamin calls historicism. So if every word that ends in a Y is a metaphysical category or a metaphysical concept, refers to a metaphysical object, then every ism is a reification of that. So historicism is the reification of history. It's the, we could say, the alienation and reification of history, historicism. which happens in the 19th century, happens in the era of industrial capitalism. Not accidentally. Earlier in the course, we read Siegfried Krakauer's essay on photography, where he drew a parallel between photography and historicism. They're both 19th century inventions. They're both inventions of the early 19th century. They're both invented in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. And Krakauer says wryly that the ideal of historicism would be a continuous film loop in which everything is photographed from every possible angle at all times. And he said, if we had that, we would think that we had a perfect knowledge of the past or of history. But in fact, we would only have the knowledge of history that could be provided by photography. Meaning it wouldn't actually give us knowledge of our interaction in relation to the past. It would not. Again, give us a kind of reified representation of it in the form of photography. So we talked about it with respect to Benjamin's Little History of Photography, that photography represents absolute continuity in space because of the monoptical, homogeneous picture plane exposure versus its discontinuity of time. The ideal of the photograph, even when it's the daguerreotype, even when it's long duration exposure, the ideal of the photograph is a snapshot. It's a discontinuity in time. Historicism, by contrast, as the photography of time or the photography of history, it is giving you absolute continuity of time and discontinuity in space. So when you read history, you're getting a seamless account of what happened, but transported outside of its original spatial context, as well as outside of its temporal context. But it gives discontinuity in space, continuity in time, or an endless series of cause and effect, an endless chain of events. As we'll see, Benjamin is going to say that, in fact, no, history also has another aspect, which is lifting things out of the flow of time and blowing apart the continuity of history. Let's see what Nietzsche says about one of his modes of history that he describes in critical history. Here's Nietzsche. A person must have the power, and from time to time use it, to break a past and dissolve it, in order to be able to live. Here it is not righteousness which sits in the judgment seat, or even less mercy which announces judgment, but life alone, that dark, driving, insatiable, self-desiring force. People or ages serving life in this way, by judging and destroying a past, are always dangerous and in danger. It is an attempt to give oneself, as it were, a past after the fact, out of which we may be descended, in opposition to the one from which we are descended. It is always a dangerous attempt because it is so difficult to find a borderline to the denial of the past, and because the second nature usually is weaker than the first. Okay, so what is he talking about there? He said he's talking about critical history? Critical history? Modes of the historical. Monumental, antiquarian, and critical. Another way of thinking about this is in terms of memory. historical is about memory. So there are three ways that we remember the past: in a monumental way, in an antiquarian way, and in a critical way. So those are his three modes of the historical or of history. And we'll see actually his three main categories are not those, but rather he calls the unhistorical and the supra-historical. So the absolute unhistorical condition would be the condition of the animal, who just lives in the perpetual present moment and has no memory in the sense of history. So the unhistorical is sort of without memory, and the superhistorical is what he calls forgetting. Transcending the historical, but also forgetting. And so, interestingly, if history is a form of remembering, or a form of memory, it's also a form of forgetting. So whenever we remember something, that also involves forgetting. Any way of remembering also involves a way of forgetting. Let's see how he introduces this. He quotes Goethe, "Incidentally, I despise everything which merely instructs me without increasing or immediately enlivening my activity." These are Goethe's words. With them, as with a heartfelt expression of ceterum censeo, I judge otherwise. Our consideration of the worth and worthlessness of history may begin. Now, what is the ceterum censeo? So he's invoking Cato. Do you have the note here? No, we don't have it. So back in ancient Rome, so a senator named Cato would get up and he would give a speech on something. He would say, "We need to build an aqueduct in so-and-so district." But no matter what speech he gave, at the end of what he was saying, any statement, he would say, "And Carthage must be destroyed." So Carthage was the big enemy of Rome. If you guys know your history, so do you know the famous Hannibal crossing the Alps to attack Rome? Right, Hannibal, the leader of the Carthaginians. So what was Carthage? So Carthage was on the opposite side of the Mediterranean from Rome, and it was the big rival to Rome. Interestingly, in the 1700s, in the 18th century, in the time of the Enlightenment, bourgeois society, the bourgeois Enlightenment, had this idea that history might have turned out better if Carthage had won and Rome had lost. Now, why is that? Because Carthage was a trading empire, whereas Rome was an empire of war and conquest. So their idea was that if only Carthage had won, we could have gotten to the society we have now, but thousands of years ago. Whereas instead we had to go through Roman civilization and the aftermath of Roman civilization, the Middle Ages, and all that shit. Right, so this is kind of a loaded comment, just those words, by Nietzsche. Because it introduces like counterfactual history too. How do we remember history? And in fact, for a very long time, it would never have occurred to anyone to regret the defeat of Carthage by the Romans. But then suddenly, the meaning of history changed, it reversed. So we may begin, he says, for this work, his essay, is to set down why, in the spirit of Goethe's saying, we must seriously despise instruction without vitality, knowledge which enervates activity, and history as an expensive surplus of knowledge and a luxury. because we lack what is still most essential to us, and because what is superfluous is hostile to what is essential. To be sure, we need history, but we need it in a manner different from the way in which the spoiled idler in the garden of knowledge uses it, no matter how elegantly he may look down on our coarse and graceless needs and distresses. That's the passage that Benjamin quotes in On the Concept of History. That is, we need it for life and action, not for a comfortable turning away from life and action, or merely for glossing over the egotistical life and the cowardly bad act. We wish to use history only insofar as it serves living, but there is a degree of doing history and a valuing of it through which life atrophies and degenerates. To bring this phenomenon to light as a remarkable symptom of our time is every bit as necessary as it may be painful. I have tried to describe a feeling which has often enough tormented me. I take my revenge on this feeling when I expose it to the general public. Perhaps with such a description, someone or other will have a reason to point out to me that he knows this particular sensation, but that I have not felt it with sufficient purity and naturalness, and definitely have not expressed myself with the appropriate certainty and mature experience. Perhaps one or two will respond in this way. However, most people will tell me that this feeling is totally wrong, unnatural, abominable, and absolutely forbidden. That with it, in fact, I have shown myself unworthy of the powerful historical tendency of the times, as it has been by common knowledge observed for the past 2 generations. So he's writing the end of the 1800s, historicism, modern historiography, early 1800s, particularly among the Germans. Whatever the reaction, now that I dare to expose myself with this natural description of my feeling, common decency will be fostered rather than shamed, because I am providing many opportunities for a contemporary tendency, like the reaction just mentioned, to make polite pronouncements. Moreover, I obtain for myself something of even more value to me than respectability. I become publicly instructed and set straight about our times. I'll say something about this essay. So it's the second of 4 essays he published as a small book called The Unfashionable Observations, or The Untimely Meditations. Unfashionable Observations. He continues, this essay is also out of touch with the times, because here I am trying for once to see as a contemporary disgrace, infirmity, and defect, something of which our age is justifiably proud, its historical culture. For I believe, in fact, that we are all suffering from a consumptive historical fever, and at the very least should recognize that we are afflicted with it. If Goethe with good reason said that with our virtues we simultaneously cultivate our faults, and if, as everyone knows, a hypertrophic virtue, as the historical sense of our age appears to me to be, can serve to destroy a people just as well as a hypertrophic vice, then people may make allowance for me this once. Also, in my defense, I should not conceal the fact that the experiences which arouse these feelings of torment in me, I have derived for the most part from myself, and only from others for the purpose of comparison, and that insofar as I am a student of more ancient times, particularly the Greeks, I come as a child in these present times to such anachronistic experiences concerning myself. But I must be allowed to ascribe this much to myself on account of my profession as a classical philolog. For I would not know what sense classical philology would have in our age unless it is to be affected by its inappropriateness for the times, that is, in opposition to the age, thus working on the age, and we hope for the benefit of a coming time. Okay, so he's a philologist, classical philology. What does that mean? It means that he studies ancient languages and ancient literature. So he studies especially Greek and Latin, but he and his friends, his cohort, his intellectual colleagues, they study classical languages and classical literature in various different cultures. So in Germany especially, in the early 19th century, archaeology, anthropology, philology, these are what we might call romantic disciplines. And so he has very close friends who study ancient Chinese language and literature, ancient Sanskrit, Indian language and literature. Arabic, language and literature. So they're trying to study all the classical languages. And philology is really attuned to tracing subtle changes in meaning in language historically, subtle changes in the usage of words, even changes in syntax and grammar, as a way of understanding changes in culture that took place in ancient history. So language is a kind of a trace of historical change in the deep past. And so it's a romantic discipline insofar as it's very geared to appreciating difference, including very subtle difference. Cultural difference, historical difference, linguistic difference. Okay, let's see how he starts off the main bit, because this is the zoomorphisms. Observe the herd which is grazing beside you. It does not know that what yesterday or today is. It springs round, eats, rests, digests, jumps up again, and so from morning to night and from day to day, with its likes and dislikes closely tied to the peg of the moment, and thus neither melancholy nor weary. To witness this is hard for man, because he boasts to himself that his human race is better than the beast, and yet looks with jealousy at its happiness. For he wishes only to live like the beast, neither weary nor amid pains. And he wants it in vain, because he does not will it as the animal does. One day the man demands of the beast, "Why do you not talk to me about your happiness and only gaze at me?" The beast wants to answer too and say, "That comes about because I always immediately forget what I wanted to say." But by then the beast has already forgotten its reply and remains silent, so that the man wonders on once more. But he also wonders about himself, that he is not able to learn to forget, and that he always hangs on to past things. No matter how far or how fast he runs, this chain runs with him. It is something amazing. The moment in one sudden motion there, in one sudden motion gone, before nothing, afterwards nothing, nevertheless comes back again as a ghost and disturbs the tranquility of each later moment. A leaf is continuously released from the roll of time, falls out, flutters away, and suddenly flutters back again into the man's lap. For the man says, "I remember," and envies the beast, which immediately forgets, and sees each moment really perish, sink back in cloud and night, and vanish forever. Thus the beast lives unhistorically, for it gets up in the present like a number without any odd fraction left over. It does not know how to play a part, hides nothing, and appears in each moment exactly and entirely what it is. Thus a beast can be nothing other than honest. By contrast, the human being resists the large and ever-increasing burden of the past, which pushes him down or bows him over. It makes his way difficult, like an invisible and dark burden, which he can for appearance's sake even deny, and when he is only too happy to deny, and which he is only too happy to deny in his interaction with his peers, in order to awaken their envy. Thus it moves him, as if he remembered a lost paradise, to see the grazing herd, or something more closely familiar, the child, which does not yet have a past to deny, and plays in blissful blindness between the fences of the past and the future. Nonetheless, this game must be upset for the child. He will be summoned all too soon out of his forgetfulness, for he learns to understand the expression, "it was." That password with which struggle, suffering, and weariness come over human beings, so as to remind him what his existence basically is, a never completed past tense. If death finally brings the longed for forgetting, it nevertheless thereby destroys present existence, and thus impresses its seal on the knowledge that existence is only an uninterrupted living in the past, something which exists for the purpose of self-denial, self-destruction, and self-contradiction. Okay, so the unhistorical. So that is not available to us. So we are historical. as Proust pointed out in his introduction, history is necessary. Without history, we betray our humanity. History is necessary. And so the only question is how we do it, how we actually perform history, how we actually practice history, how we use history. Okay, and that's when he gets into his three kinds of history, or three modes of history: the monumental, the antiquarian, and the critical. So the monumental is the first form of history that we have. And it is, as we usually think of these things, it's about the great events and great figures of history. It's about the times and the figures, the events, the actions that have made us who we are. So what happened in the past that created us? How did we become who we are? And in that respect, the founding moments of, as he puts it, a culture or a civilization or a people, it doesn't matter how much time passes, those remain equally great. So the great events and figures, the actions of the past that define a people are, in this sense, eternal. They're monumentalized. However, he thinks that this must necessarily give way to the antiquarian. So what is the antiquarian? So with monumental history, we only have to recall, we only have to remember the big canonical things. We only have to remember the events, figures, actions of the past that really matter. We know what matters and what doesn't matter. We know what really counts as significant and what does not. Eventually, however, as a culture develops, it loses that sense of certainty about what matters with regard to the past. And that brings about a kind of anxiety about memory. So antiquarian history takes the place of monumental history, and we seek to remember everything. We want all the facts, all the details, all the data of the past. Why? Because we've lost the ability to judge what's important and what's not important. We've lost the ability to discriminate between the major and the minor events and figures and actions. That's historicism. So historicism is this attempt at absolute memory, absolute remembering everything. And so it's a building up of the archive. But he says that in antiquarian history, we've lost, it's the product of losing the ability, and it also contributes to our remaining lost of the ability to decide, make judgments about what's important and what's not important. It says that we drown in the dust of bibliographic quizquillia in the library. Right, so the past is sort of an endless, inexhaustible trove of knowledge and data in which we are completely disoriented as to what's important and what isn't. That's because we no longer have a sense of our own values. So monumental history is based on certainty about our values, but as cultures develop, they lose that certainty. And they go through this phase of antiquarian history. That in turn gives rise to critical history, when people suddenly realize that they have to decide what's important again. So they have to sort through, they have to sort the wheat from the chaff. They have to figure out what's important. They have to make decisions, judgments. They have to decide what their values are. And they do that by judging the past. That's the critical history. critical means like crisis and decision. It's kind of like a crossroads, a turning point. And then, of course, that will create a new monumental history. When some people's values change, then they change their notion of history, and that sets up a new monumental history, which eventually will give way to a kind of antiquarian confusion, which will then bring about the need for deciding again what's important. So the cycle repeats itself. And he sees this as having occurred several times over the course of so-called Western history, but also it can be seen in non-Western history, that cultures and civilizations go through these phases. A canonical sense of themselves that gives way to kind of confusion and disorientation, which then brings about a new set of values that establishes a new canon for itself out of the past. So he thinks that Western civilization, European civilization in the 19th century is in this antiquarian phase. It's in this phase of confusion in which everything is equally important, and therefore people have lost the ability to make sense of the past because they've actually lost the sense of the present. They've lost a sense of values in the present. So, the superhistorical is the need to transform the historical. It's the need to transcend, but also negate what was formerly the dominant sense of history. So he says, with the phrase the unhistorical, I designate the art and power of being able to forget and to enclose oneself in a horizon of borders. Superhistorical, I call the powers which divert the gaze from what is developing back to what gives existence an eternal and unchanging character, to art and religion. Science, for it is science which would talk about poisons, sees in that force and these powers opposing forces, for it maintains that only the observation of things is true and right, the scientific way of considering things, which everyone sees what has come into being as something historical and never as something eternally living. Science lives in an inner contradiction against the eternalizing powers of art and religion, just as much as it hates forgetfulness, the death of knowledge, when it seeks to remove all limitations of horizons and to hurl human beings into an infinite sea without frontiers, a sea of light waves of accumulated, of acknowledged becoming. Okay, so objective history would be this kind of historicism. It would be this scientific approach to history. And certainly the Germans in the 19th century as paving the way for this, and not alone, but really through the universities that they're establishing and these disciplines that they're developing, like classical philology. They are doing this in the name of science, scientific understanding of the past. Archaeology, anthropology, philology. The study of the history of religion, the study of the history of art is to be done scientifically, and in Nietzsche's sense, objectively. But in so doing, we lost sight of the subjective needs. Now, this is the early Nietzsche. So the early Nietzsche had made this kind of distinction between art and philosophy. The way he puts it here is art and religion versus philosophy and science. His other writings from this time, from his early career, in The Birth of Tragedy, it's his first major work that got a lot of public exposure. He talked about the birth of theoretical man in the form of Socrates and Plato, and that this created an objective notion of truth that lost sight of subjective need. So there was a kind of subjective versus objective. So art and religion speaks to the subjective, and philosophy and science speaks to the objective. And so it's a kind of hiving off of the subjective and the objective, which he decried. The birth of theoretical man, the idea of objective truth, which destroyed our sense of life and our subjective needs. Later on, he complicates this. He actually separates science and philosophy out from each other, and sort of gives more credit to science and attacks rather philosophy. Here, he's attacking them together as objectivistic. Okay, so here what he says is, so if science has hurled human beings into an infinite sea without frontiers, a sea of light waves of acknowledged becoming, if only he could live there. As the cities collapse in an earthquake and become desolate, and the human being, trembling and in haste, erects his house on volcanic ground, so life breaks apart and becomes weak and dispirited when the earthquake of ideas which science arouses takes from a person the basis of all his certainty and rest, his faith in the eternally permanent. Is life to rule over knowledge now, over science, or is knowledge to rule over life? Which of the two forces is the higher and decisive one? No one will have any doubt. Life is the higher, the ruling power. For knowledge which destroyed life would in the process have destroyed itself. Knowledge presupposes life and has the same interest in preserving life which every being has in its own continuing existence. So science needs a higher supervision and control. A doctrine of a healthy life is positioned close beside science, and a principle of this doctrine of health would sound like this. The unhistorical and the superhistorical are the natural countermeasures against the excess, cancerous growth of history on life, against the historical sickness. It is probable that we, the historically ill, also have to suffer from the countermeasures. But the fact that we suffer from them is no proof against the correctness of the course of treatment we have chosen. And here I recognize the mission of that youth, that first generation of fighters and dragon slayers, which brings forth a more fortunate and more beautiful culture and humanity, without having more of this future happiness and future beauty than a promise-filled premonition. These youth will suffer from the evil and the countermeasures simultaneously, and nevertheless they believe they may boast of a more powerful health and in general a more natural nature than their previous generations, the educated men and old men of the present. However, their mission is to shake the ideas which this present holds about health and culture, and to develop contempt and hatred against such hybrid monstrous ideas. The most strongly guaranteed mark of their own stronger health is to be precisely the fact that they, I mean these youth, themselves, can use no idea, no party slogan from the presently circulating currency of words and ideas as a designation of their being, but are convinced only by a power acting in it, a power which fights, eliminates, and cuts into pieces, and by an always heightened sense of life in every good hour. People may dispute the fact that these youth already have culture, but for what young person would this be a reproach? People may speak against their crudeness and in moderation, but they are not yet old and wise enough to be content. Above all, they do not need to feign any ready-made culture to defend and enjoy all the comforts and rights of youth, especially the privilege of a braver, spontaneous honesty and the rousing consolation of hope. Of these hopeful people, I know that they understand all these generalities at close hand, and in their own personal experience will translate them into a personally thought-out teaching for themselves. The others may, for the time being, perceive nothing but covered over bowls, which could also really be empty, until, surprised one day, they see with their own eyes that the bowls are full, and that attacks, demands, living impulses, passions lay mixed in and impressed into these generalities, which could not lie hidden in this way for a long time. I refer these doubters to time, which brings all things to light, And in conclusion, I turn my attention to that society of those who hope, in order to explain to them in an allegory the progress and outcome of their healing, their salvation from their historical sickness, and thus their own history, up to the point where they will be again healthy enough to undertake a new history and to make use of the past under the mastery of life in a threefold sense. That is, monumental, or antiquarian, or critical. At that point of time, they will be less knowledgeable than the educated of the present, for they will have forgotten a good deal, and even have lost the pleasure of looking for what those educated ones above all wish to know, in general still in order to look back. Their distinguishing marks from the point of view of those educated ones are precisely their lack of education, their indifference and reserve with respect to many famous men, even with respect to many good things. But they have become, at this final point of their healing, once again men, and have ceased to be human-like aggregates. That is something. There are still hopes. Are you not laughing at that in your hearts, you hopeful ones? And you will ask, how do we come to that end point? The Delphic god shouts out to you at the very start of your trek to that goal his aphorism, know thyself, know yourself. It is a difficult saying, for that god hides nothing and announces nothing, but only points the way, as Heraclitus has said. But what direction is he indicating to you? There were centuries when the Greeks found themselves in a danger similar to the one in which we find ourselves. That is, the danger of destruction from being swamped by what is foreign and past, from history. The Greeks never lived in proud isolation. Their culture was for a long time much more a chaos of foreign, Semitic, Babylonian, Lydian, and Egyptian forms and ideas, and their religion a real divine struggle of the entire Orient. Something similar to the way German culture and religion are now a self-struggling chaos of all foreign lands and all prehistory. Nevertheless, Hellenic culture did not become an aggregate, thanks to that Apollonian saying, know thyself. The Greeks learned gradually to organize the chaos, because in accordance with the Delphic teaching, they directed their thoughts back to themselves, that is, to their real needs, and let the apparent needs die off. So they seized possession of themselves again. They did not remain long the over-endowed heirs and epigonies of the entire Orient. After an arduous battle with themselves, through the practical interpretation of that saying, they became the most fortunate enrichers and increasers of the treasure they had inherited, and the firstlings and models for all future national cultures. This is a parable for every individual among us. He must organize the chaos in himself by recalling in himself his own real needs. His honesty, his better and more genuine character must now and then struggle against what will be constantly repeated, relearned, and imitated. He begins then to grasp that culture can still be something other than a decoration of life, that is basically always only pretense and disguise, for all ornamentation covers over what is decorated. So the Greek idea of culture revealed itself to him. In opposition to the Roman, the idea of culture as a new and improved physis, or nature. Without inner and outer, without pretense and convention, culture as a unanimity of living, thinking, appearing, and willing. Thus he learns out of his own experience that it was the higher power of moral nature through which the Greeks attained their victory over all other cultures, and that each increase of truthfulness must also be a demand and preparation for true culture. This truthfulness may also occasionally seriously harm the idea of culture esteemed at the time. It may even be able to assist a totally decorative culture to collapse. Okay, so again, the idea that the youth or the present should judge the past and should decide what's important and what's not important. So the present critiques the past in Nietzsche's view. The present critiques the way the past is affecting it. We'll see what Benjamin does with that. He does something similar, but a kind of complementary.
just have like one feeling with him talking about that. He often didn't feel like the history is the real when we're watching it now. It's more like the literary person wants to tell us forward in history. Like the didn't say that how many person he killed or how many person he didn't want there. He only tell us that but that day he success to make someone have the freedom basically. So that you can say that I choose a sentence with the nature of this sentence becoming clearly if we ask with all that historian actually.
So if it hides the exploitation of the past that made the moment possible. Well, okay, so let's, before we turn to the venue game, okay, I want to do one other thing to help set up the concept of history by Benjamin, and that is Benjamin's Theologico-political fragment. Which we'll see a version of this, like a really compressed version of what he's saying here in the second thesis on the concept of history. But this sort of establishes some terms that we need to pay attention to follow what Benjamin is doing. And that's the idea of redemption, and it goes to what Shimon was just saying, namely, how do we redeem the suffering of the past? How is history involved in, again, if history is the relation between the past and the present, how is that relation of the present to the past involved in trying to redeem the suffering of the past? All right, so let's look at this. It's important because usually Benjamin is misconstrued as a theological thinker. Instead, what he's doing is he's interpreting the theological categories, meaning he's understanding theological categories from a Marxist standpoint. What's the actual meaning of these theological categories? All right, so this is the theological-political fragment. Only the Messiah himself consummates all history, in the sense that he alone redeems, completes, creates its relation to the Messianic. Do we encountered the term redeem previously with experience of poverty? Use it almost as like a monetary financial term, and we'll see that has some bearing here as well. So he's associating the Messianic with redemption. For this reason alone, nothing historical can relate itself on its own account to anything Messianic. Therefore, the kingdom of God is not the telos, or the goal of this historical dynamic. It cannot be said as the goal. From the standpoint of history, it is not the goal, but the end. Okay, so what does he mean by this? The kingdom of God, or the coming of the Messiah, what does that mean, like in theological terms? It means the end of time. So he mixes Jewish and Christian theology kind of seamlessly. But let's go with that and think about the beginning and the end of time. So there was a time before time, namely paradise. So Adam and Eve in Eden, there was no time. They didn't get old, they didn't get sick, they didn't die. They didn't biologically reproduce. So everything that was created was eternal. All the plants, all the animals, Adam and Eve. Then, of course, Eve was seduced by the serpent to defy the one rule that God gave them. He said, all this is for you, except you can't eat from the tree of knowledge. So Eve convinced Adam that they should eat the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, and as punishment, they were expelled from paradise. It's interesting that it's the tree of knowledge. It's also interesting that it's an act of freedom to attain knowledge that gets them expelled from paradise. And that introduces time. It introduces mortality, death. It introduces biological reproduction. As punishment for knowledge and for freedom, for the exercise of freedom and for the acquisition of knowledge. The other thing that happens is that they forget the names of things. So in Eden, Adam helped God give names to things, and when expelled from paradise, Adam and Eve forget the true names of things, and then have to come up with new names for things that they know are not the true names for things. It's no longer God's names for things, but only their own human names for things. So it introduces a imperfection and fallibility in language that didn't exist in Eden either. Okay, so that's the beginning of time. What's the end of time? So the end of time, when the Messiah comes and the kingdom of God is established, then what is supposed to happen? So time ends, and everything that has ever lived and died is brought back to life, is resurrected, is bodily resurrected, to live eternally. So all the plants, all the animals, all the humans who have ever lived and died come back in their bodies to live eternally. So it's outside of history. So it refers to the restoration of a condition before historical time. And that's why redemption can't happen within history, but only outside of history, at the end of history. So from the standpoint of history, the Messianic kingdom of God is not the goal, but the end. Therefore, the order of the profane cannot be built up on the idea of the divine kingdom, and therefore theocracy has no political, but only a religious meaning. Okay, so what is going on now? So he's using, as we've encountered in the Noetic faculty piece, he's introducing some anthropological, not only theological, but kind of anthropological categories. Ancient and modern, say, messianic and theological, as opposed to the historical and the political. We could also say the sacred and the profane. There's also, to use again, some kind of Western language. The celestial and the secular. So there's celestial authority, that's the authority of the church. It's eternal like the stars, that's why it's called celestial. And then there's secular authority, or political authority. So there's a very famous phrase by Jesus: render unto Caesar what Caesar is due, but render unto God what God is due. Meaning the separation of your obligation to the political secular authority and your obligation to celestial divine authority. he says, to have repudiated with utmost vehemence the political significance of theocracy is the cardinal merit of Ernst Bloch's Spirit of Utopia. So where's Ernst Bloch? He's a friend of Benjamin, also a friend of Lukács, who, like Lukács and Benjamin, converts to Marxism as a result of the Russian Revolution. The order of the profane, Benjamin says, should be erected on the idea of happiness. The relation of this order to the messianic is one of the essential teachings of the philosophy of history. It is the precondition of a mystical conception of history containing a problem that can be represented figuratively. If one arrow points to the goal towards which the profane dynamic acts, and another marks the direction of messianic intensity, then certainly the quest of free humanity for happiness runs counter to the messianic direction. The quest of free humanity for happiness would also be life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. This quest of free humanity for happiness runs counter to the messianic direction. But just as a force can, through acting, increase another acting in the opposite direction, so the order of the profane can, or assists, through being profane, the coming of the messianic kingdom. The profane, therefore, although not itself a category of this kingdom, is a decisive category of its quietist approach. For in happiness, all that is earthly seeks its downfall, and only in good fortune is its downfall destined to find it. Whereas admittedly, the immediate and messianic intensity of the heart, of the inner man in isolation, passes through misfortune as suffering. To the spiritual restitutio in integrum, that's the restoration of bodily integrity, which introduces immortality, corresponds a worldly restitution that leads to the eternity of downfall. And the rhythm of this eternally transient, worldly existence, transient in its totality, in its spatial, but also in its temporal totality, the rhythm of messianic nature is happiness. For nature is messianic by reason of its eternal and total passing away. To strive after such passing, even for those stages of man that are nature, is the task of world politics, whose method must be called nihilism. Okay. So the action of redemption. Two kinds of redemption that he has in mind. There's the messianic redemption, or the theological redemption. There's the celestial or eternal redemption. And that would be redemption from unhappiness. So one would need redemption only insofar as one is unhappy or suffering from misfortune. And so you're supposed to have the happiness you were denied in life at the end of time. That's why you're resurrected in your body. You're supposed to have the bodily happiness that was denied you in temporal existence at the end of time. So that would be the theological or the messianic. Now what about the political? What about the political? So political redemption is different. Historical redemption, secular redemption, paradoxically, is different. And that would be not the redemption of unhappiness, but rather the redemption of unfreedom. Meaning, as far as history is concerned, the dead are dead. They're not coming back. Misfortune, suffering, unhappiness can't be redeemed. It can't be redeemed within time. It can't be redeemed within history. It can only be redeemed, if at all, outside of history, outside of time. So the only thing that can be redeemed within history is unfreedom. Again, the Hegel. history is progress in consciousness. Freedom. What is consciousness of freedom? The theory and practice of freedom. It's not just consciousness in terms of our thought, or in terms of our theory, or philosophy, but practically. Consciousness also means practically. So what can be achieved in terms of redemption within secular or profane reality? The quest of free humanity for happiness. Not happiness. One doesn't have a right to happiness. One only has the right to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness. Especially because what counts as happiness changes historically. What makes us happy is different from what made ancient peoples happy. And what made them happy wouldn't make us happy. The good life is historically variable. Happiness is historically variable. All right, so the issue, of course, is progress. Progress in consciousness and freedom. How is history progress in consciousness and freedom? And also, is there progress in the modern era? Is there progress in capitalism? Does capitalism represent progress in consciousness and freedom or not? That's really the issue. Let's look at the first two theses. So, two of the most famous theses from the Concept of History article by Benjamin are also the most misunderstood. The first, the chess player, and then later, the angel of history. They're completely misconstrued. They're attributed the opposite meaning that they actually have. So let's see the chess player to begin with. So there was once, he writes, we know an automaton constructed in such a way that it could respond to every move by a chess player with a counter move that would ensure the winning of the game. A puppet wearing Turkish attire and with a hook in its mouth sat before a chessboard placed on a large table. A system of mirrors created the illusion that this table was transparent on all sides. Actually, a hunchbacked dwarf, a master at chess, sat inside and guided the puppet's hands by means of strings. One can imagine a philosophic counterpart to this apparatus. The puppet, called historical materialism, or Marxism, is to win all the time. It can easily be a match for anyone if it enlists the services of theology, which today, as we know, is small and ugly and has to be kept out of sight. Okay, so this is usually misconstrued as Benjamin arguing for Marxism needing, like, theology as a supplement. No. What he's saying is that there's an unacknowledged theology within Marxism by which it plays a trick on itself. In other words, in 1940, Marxism isn't winning all the time. Actually, it's losing all the time. So he raises Rosa Luxemburg, who we read earlier in the semester, as a model for this kind of historical consciousness he would like to advocate for or uphold here. So what was that? That was history of defeat, history of failure, history of losing. So what's going on in the 1930s? What is Benjamin talking about? He's talking about the degeneration of Marxism as an affirmation of the progress of history. So no matter what happens, history is still progressing. Despite anything, the struggle continues, and in the end, we're going to win, and in fact, that means that we're winning all the time. And he's saying no. He calls this the faith in progress. faith in progress. So it's a hidden, unacknowledged theology in the assumption of a progressivism with regards to history. The assumption that we've made progress over the past is like a religious faith or a religious belief. It's like an unacknowledged theological way of making sense of history. And he's attacking it. Because it's an illusion, it's a trick, it's unacknowledged, it's a deception. It's a self-deception. So in a time when they're losing all the time, the communists are saying that they're winning all the time. So an example of this is, I don't know if I mentioned this when we read Wilhelm Reich about the Nazi seizure of power. The Communist Party, before Hitler took power, they literally had a slogan. Their slogan was, after Hitler, us. Right? Meaning, like, Hitler will pave the way to the revolution. No, Hitler killed off all the socialists and communists. Right, so the idea is that even if Hitler comes to power, it's still part of the forward march of history. It's still part of the inevitable objective progress of history. No. So Benjamin is attacking that. He's attacking faith in progress. And we'll see he thinks that related to faith in progress is this objectivistic view of history. Historicism. So historical materialism, or Marxism, has succumbed to historicism, has succumbed to the reification of history, and to an objective view of history, meaning history is objectively progressive. No, it's only progressive if people struggle to make historical progress. History isn't automatically progressive. It's not an automaton. Right, so even when people today talk about which side of history are you on, right, there's an assumption that history is moving in a progressive direction, and if you try to stand in the way of progress, then you're wrong. You're objectively wrong. Right, so the Democrats think that Trump and the Republicans are objectively wrong. Well, that kind of doesn't matter. I mean, things are changing. And they're changing as a function of politics, not out of a function of objective progress. Right? It matters what people do and don't do. The struggle matters. It's not as if things will work out in the end, and we can be confident about that objective progress. No. And anyway, that's a kind of an absurd notion of history to begin with. Okay, so the second thesis is, like I said, kind of a restatement of what he raised in the Theologico-political fragment. So let's look at it. It says, "It is one of the most noteworthy peculiarities of the human heart," writes Lotz, "that so much selfishness in individuals coexists with a general lack of envy, which every present day feels towards the future, or towards its future. This observation indicates that the image of happiness we cherish is thoroughly colored by the time to which the course of our own existence has assigned us. There is happiness, such as could arouse envy in us, only in the air we have breathed, among people we could have talked to, women who could have given themselves to us. In other words, the idea of happiness is indissolubly bound up with the idea of redemption. The same applies to the idea of the past, which is the concern of history. The past carries with it a secret index by which it is referred to redemption. Doesn't a breath of the air that pervaded earlier days caress us as well? In the voices we hear, isn't there an echo of now silent ones? Don't the women we court have sisters they no longer recognize? If so, then there is a secret agreement between past generations and the present one. Then our coming was expected on earth. Then, like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power on which the past has a claim. Such a claim cannot be settled cheaply. The historical materialist is aware of this." Okay, so what he does is, he changes the referent for historical materialism. So he starts out with the Marxism, the historical materialism that he's criticizing, and then he brings in his own definition. So he's contesting the meaning of Marxism. He's contesting historical materialism. He's offering his version as opposed to the one that's prevailing at the time, the kind of Stalinist one, the official ideology of the Soviet Union. The third is also related. The chronicler who narrates events without distinguishing between major and minor ones acts in accord with the following truth. Nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as lost in history. Of course, only a redeemed mankind is granted the fullness of its past, which is to say, only for a redeemed mankind has its past become citable in all its moments. Each moment it has lived becomes a citation of the order of the day, and that day is Judgment Day. So, again, the idea that we will be able to redeem history within time, not at the end of time, only through a successful struggle for freedom. Then we can have a changed relationship to the past. Yeah, this is, assuming that's what you address that part. I'll elaborate on the comment you left here.
Wait, I'm thinking that we still talking about the Benjamin, or I can talking about another one?
Benjamin.
Oh, so that because that when reading him that I don't have any feedback. My feedback is just that two paragraphs.
Mm-hmm.
So that in my thinking that the history that we know and now is looks more like a piece of do you know a story about to touch the elephant? That so many persons they cannot say anything, but when we touch the elephant because they only can touch one piece of them, so that everyone didn't know what the elephant really watching that. I think the history is the same feeling like that. Because we only can get the history becoming a story or some project becoming so many years ago, so that those history is more like the person or that time person wants really know history, so that we only can say that maybe in those country person they feel that history is looking like that. But what is the real history? Maybe we need like the same like same happened, but we know that happened as the first time it's coming one country, like coming the United Kingdom. And they say that's history like the United States, the beginning history. Maybe in the United Kingdom paper they say we bring so many social things to give to this very big island to tell them what is the science, what is the math, to tell them so many new things. But maybe the person live actually instead at that time, that maybe like 300 years ago, they were feeling that we have our own life, but one day someone coming, they broken our life. So that's for the same history in the two part of different person, when they're looking for them, it's very different.
Right, so the difficulty is, so historicism had this idea of, or has this idea of the past as it actually was, and so it tries to kind of take history out of its flow and sort of tries to kind of restore the past as a totality by breaking it out of its subsequent time, like what the time that follows, what leads to the present. So it's to sort of seal the past off from the present. And Benjamin is saying that that's that kind of objectivity of the past that he wants to break with that idea. That first of all, that's impossible, but second of all, it's also undesirable. And the reason it's undesirable is that it basically affirms what happened. It leaves, again, to use the language that Peter Proust used in the introduction to Nietzsche, it leaves the past as something to be contemplated rather than something that we're actively appropriating into our present being. Now, and you have quoted here that with whom does historicism actually sympathize? The answer is inevitable with the victor. So meaning it tends to affirm what happened. So where Benjamin is going with this is that he's going to advocate for what he calls reading history against the grain of what happened. So the objective view of history tends to affirm the current relationship between the past and the present, whereas the point is to change that relationship between the past and the present, and to bring out what in the past seemingly did not lead to the present, meaning the past's sort of unfulfilled potential, rather than, again, he thinks historicism, trying to look at the past as it actually was, tends to affirm the way the present is already appropriating the past and the accumulation of the past into the present, which affirms not only what happened in the past, but affirms the way things are now, affirms the present. So he's advocating instead for looking at the past against the grain of history, and he's doing that because he's interested not only in the unfulfilled potential of the past, but also the unfulfilled potential in the present. So if we go all the way back to the beginning of the course, where we're talking about what is and what ought to be, the dialectic of being and becoming, that this also bears on the past, it bears on history. Right, so even what is not entirely settled. So to say that the past is not dead, the past is not even past, is to say that its stakes are still in contention. So not only the fate of the present and the future is at stake, but the fate of the past is at stake. Right, so the danger threatens both the content of the tradition and those inherited. Right, so when we think of history in the kind of historicist or antiquarian way, we think of it as an objective archive of knowledge, as a kind of objective accumulation. I think of it not only as an objective accumulation of facts, but we also accumulate action. We accumulate all the past action into the present in an unproblematic way. Determinism, historical determinism. Historical determinism would mean not only that things had to have happened as they did, but also that the present must necessarily be what it is. So he's trying to approach history in a very different way, in the opposite way, which is to denaturalize the present and not accept or affirm what is. And that also means not accepting seemingly what was. So his notion of critical history is a little bit different. So Nietzsche's notion of critical history is that the present judges the past. Benjamin's notion of critical history, he does accept the present critiquing the past, but he also thinks that the past critiques the present. Meaning that looking at history in terms of the past's unfulfilled potential is also a way of critiquing the present. Now, why is he going through all this argument? Because he thinks that this problem and this task can be hidden behind what he calls acedia, or melancholia, or sadness, or nostalgia. That he wants to find the critical value of melancholia with regard to the past. So the phrase that he uses that refers to what we were talking about earlier, he says, how sad you'd have to be to want to resurrect Carthage. How sad you'd have to be to want to resurrect Carthage. Yes. It's in the seventh thesis. And it's a quote from Flaubert. So, how sad you'd have to be to want to resurrect Carthage, but also there's a hope in there. Meaning, wanting to resurrect Carthage is also about what one desires in the present. It's not only a desire to change the past, but it speaks to an aspiration in the present. So there's a kind of unconscious melancholia and an unconscious sadness to objective history, to historicism, to scientific history. It seems like the only alternative to that is this avowed nostalgia, sadness, melancholia, and he's trying to find the critical value in that. And to say that actually that has a claim on our attention too, that is a valid form of knowledge about the past. It may not fit our notion of a scientific knowledge of the past, but that's because our notion of a scientific knowledge of the past is objectivistic and reified and really cuts out the subject. Here's a final point that I'll make and we can take a break, which is history is not a thing. Right? The reification of history is what he's arguing against. So what is history? It's an activity. It's a relation, but it's also an activity. It's an action. So the concern is how we do history, how we relate to the past as an active function. So it's not contemplative knowledge as if we're separated from the object. It's not that kind of reified notion of objective truth. But rather, no, objective truth is always subjective in some way, and the question is, in what way? So we've talked about it in terms of reification, the disintegration of the dialectic of subject and object, where we can no longer recognize the objective as our own doing, and something that we have a stake in, and something that we're involved in reproducing through our activity. Instead, we treat it as outside of ourselves. It's not. Again, the Nietzsche point, there is no knowledge without the human subject of that knowledge. Another way of thinking about it is truth versus fact. I can't remember which film it is. There's an Indiana Jones movie. It's really great. It's not the first one. I don't think it's Raiders of the Lost Ark. I think it's a later one. So you know that he's an archaeology professor, right? And so I think he writes on the board, archaeology is about fact. If you want to know about truth, go down the hall and talk to the philosophy professor. Meaning, there's the fact, but then there's what it means to us and how we actively relate to it. Our judgments about it, our value of it. So it's the distinction between fact and value. Right, so history is, and especially from a philosophical standpoint, is not the same as a kind of archaeological collection of data, the facts of the past. The fact that the facts of the past can stand in for historical knowledge is the perversion, history becoming deadly, historicism, the reification of history. All right, let's take a short break. As we're waiting for people to return. All right, so let's get into more of the details of the concept of history. We'll look at theses 4 and 5. So he's got an epigraph by Hegel: "Seek for food and clothing first, then shall the kingdom of God be granted to you." Might be a critical kind of quotation of Hegel there. Well, let's see. Class struggle, which for a historian schooled in Marx is always in evidence, is a fight for the crude and material things without which no refined and spiritual things could exist. But these latter things, which are present in class struggle, are not present as a vision of spoils that fall to the victor. They are alive in this struggle as confidence, courage, humor, cunning, and fortitude, and have effects that reach far back into the past. They constantly call into question every victory, past and present, of the rulers. As flowers turn towards the sun, what has been strives to turn, by dint of a secret heliotropism, toward that sun which is rising in the sky of history. The historical materialist must be aware of this most inconspicuous of all transformations. Okay, so on the one hand, there's the sun rising in history. On the other hand, in Thesis 5, the true image of the past flits by. The past can be seized only as an image that flashes up at the moment of its recognizability and is never seen again. So this should remind us of the mimetic faculty, where he talks about the flashing up, the unity of thinking and reading, writing, sort of synesthetic, non-sensuous similarity. The truth will not run away from us. This statement by Gottfried Keller indicates exactly that point in historicism's image of history, where the image is pierced by historical materialism. For it is an irretrievable image of the past which starts to disappear in any present that does not recognize itself as intended in that image. So again, the idea of objective history, objective facts, make it seem like those are all established once and for all, that they're going to be eternally given. He's saying, well, no. Articulating the past historically does not mean recognizing it the way it really was. It means appropriating the memory as it flashes up in a moment of danger. Historical materialism wishes to hold fast that image of the past which unexpectedly appears to the historical subject in a moment of danger. The danger threatens both the content of the tradition and those who inherit it. For both, it is one and the same thing, the danger of becoming a tool of the ruling classes. Every age must strive anew to wrest tradition away from the conformism that is working to overpower it. The Messiah comes not only as the Redeemer, he comes as the victor over the Antichrist. The only historian capable of feigning the spark of hope in the past is the one who is firmly convinced that even the dead are not safe from the enemy if he is victorious, and and this enemy has never ceased to be victorious. He quotes Brecht, "Consider the darkness and the great cold in this veil resounding with mystery." Addressing himself to the historian he wishes to relive in era, Fustel du Collage recommends that he blot out everything he knows about the later course of history. There is no better way of characterizing the method which historical materialism has broken with. It is a process of empathy. Its origin is indolence of the heart, that acedia, or melancholy, that despairs of appropriating the genuine historical image as it briefly flashes up. Among medieval theologians, acedia was regarded as the root cause of sadness. Flaubert, who was familiar with it, wrote, how sad you'd have to be to want to resuscitate Carthage. The nature of this sadness becomes clearer if we ask, with whom does historicism actually sympathize? The answer is inevitable, with the victor. And all rulers are the heirs of prior conquerors. Hence, empathizing with the victor invariably benefits the current rulers. Historical materialist knows what this means. Whoever has emerged victorious participates to this day in the triumphal procession in which current rulers step over those who are lying prostrate. According to traditional practice, the spoils are carried in the procession. They are called cultural treasures, and a historical materialist views them with cautious detachment. For in every case, these treasures have a lineage which he cannot contemplate without horror. They owe their existence not only to the efforts of the great geniuses who created them, but also to the anonymous toil of others who lived in the same period. That's what Zhimeng was talking about. There is no document of culture which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And just as such a document is never free of barbarism, so barbarism taints the manner in which it was transmitted from one hand to another. The historical materialist therefore dissociates himself from this process of transmission as far as possible. He regards it as his task to brush history against the grain. Now, if you recall barbarism, we've encountered this term a few times in the course. So we encountered it in the Experience in Poverty piece, as also in Kant, although Kant didn't use the term barbarism, but he was nonetheless referring to it. So barbarism isn't the absence of culture; it's a kind of surplus of culture. It's a over-civilized or over-cultured, which can also be merely civilized and merely cultured. Nietzsche also is bringing that into his discussion at the end of use and abuse of history for life. So the savage is without culture, the barbarian is with a decadent culture, and is kind of overburdened by culture. So recall that in Experience in Poverty, Benjamin said that he wanted a positive concept of barbarism. The will to the tabula rasa, to clear away and figure out what's essential and construct from that. Otherwise, one is threatened with being overwhelmed with the cultural inheritance. Now, Clement Greenberg also had a term for this. He called it Alexandrianism. And Alexandrianism is what happens when knowledge and culture and art and philosophy are things that you find in a library. They're things in the archive, like the library at Alexandria. So knowledge is something that's, a storehouse, it's archived, it's dead. So it's when the past is accumulated and has become this dead weight on the present. So the question is how to get out from that condition. And for Benjamin, the specific barbarism that we're dealing with is capitalism. So capitalism has a particular way of accumulating the past into the present. A particular way of the present relating to and interacting with the past. So he writes, this tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. We must attain to a conception of history that accords with this insight. Then we will clearly see that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, and this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism. One reason fascism has a chance is that in the name of progress, its opponents treat it as a historical norm. The current amazement that the things we are experiencing are still possible in the 20th century is not philosophical. The amazement is not the beginning of knowledge unless it is the knowledge that the view of history which gives rise to it is untenable. So the fact that we're surprised by what happens, that these things are still happening, no. Because again, that would be the faith in progress. That would be the kind of belief, the kind of religious faith in progress, and the notion of kind of automatic, objective progress. That notion of history is untenable. And also, at the same time, that it kind of normalizes fascism. So it doesn't grasp the true nature of the state of emergency because it naturalizes it, it normalizes it, and assumes that it was that way, but it's not that way anymore. So by reifying the past, we also reify the present. Okay, and this brings us to the angel of history, the other aphorism that is often misconstrued. So he quotes his friend Gerhard Scholem, who has this painting by Paul Klee. It's kind of a weird painting. I don't know if it's a good painting or not. It's the Angelus Novus. But anyway, Benjamin's doing an interpretation of this painting in this aphorism. And he quotes Scholem, "My wing is ready for flight. I would like to turn back. If I stayed ever living time, I'd still have little luck." So I'd still be unlucky even if I could stop time. There's a picture by Klee called Angelus Novus. It shows an angel who seems about to move away from something he stares at. So if we look at this painting, he's staring at the viewer. Right, so he's moving away, he's moving back from the viewer. That's important. This is how the angel, his eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. By the way, what we have here is an exaggerated version of this optical illusion that painters use. So how do you create the illusion that a figure in a painting is looking at the viewer? By making them slightly wall-eyed. So by exaggerating it, right, what you have is that the angel is looking at you, but never looking at you, looking past you, looking through you. So his eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how the angel of history must look. His face is turned towards the past. Where a chain of events appears before us, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it at his feet. So this is important. The angel of history is not our perspective at all. It can't be our perspective, because the angel of history exists outside of time. So we exist within time, so we see a chain of events. He sees one thing. So that's not our perspective. We live within time, within history. We can't have the perspective of the angel of history. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise and has got caught in his wings. It is so strong that the angel can no longer close them. This storm drives him irresistibly into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows towards the sky. What we call progress is this storm. So what I was talking about earlier about how time was introduced into the world, it's a function of the expulsion from paradise. And yet the angels, like God, exist outside of time. So they have a perspective on time from outside of time. That is not our perspective. So the angel, this specific angel, the angel of history, is facing the past and blowing backwards into the future. That's not our perspective. That's not our perspective. Our perspective, because that's how it's usually misinterpreted, that he's somehow giving an image of our perspective. No, our perspective is that we face the future. We don't face the past. We face the future. Right. Now we might imagine a perspective from which we would look at the past. And that would be our imagination of the angel of history. But in doing that, we're placing ourselves, we're trying to imagine a perspective outside of time. And of course, that can never happen. So we can imagine for ourselves a perspective outside of time. The way Nietzsche, in On Truth and Lie in an Extra Moral Sense, had this kind of God's eye view on humanity before humanity existed and after humanity will no longer exist. That's something that we imagine, but it's not actually our perspective. It's kind of an imagined perspective on ourselves that we concoct to torment ourselves. But it isn't actually the way we exist. We exist within time. We only have knowledge of ourselves within time. We don't have knowledge of ourselves before time or after time or from outside of time. We only have knowledge from within time. Right. So nonetheless, we move through time, and then we imagine this perspective that also has a moving perspective on time, and that would be this back towards the future, fixated on the past, watching the one constant catastrophe building. Okay, this is the conformism which has marked the Social Democrats from the beginning. Attaches not only to their political tactics, but also to their economic views as well. It is one reason for the eventual breakdown of their party. So this is the party that Rosa Luxemburg was talking about in the crisis of German social democracy. Nothing has so corrupted the German working class as the notion that it was moving with the current. It regarded technological development as the driving force of the stream with which it thought it was moving. So again, faith in progress would be also faith in technology. From there, it was but a step to the illusion that the factory work ostensibly furthering technological progress constituted a political achievement. The old Protestant work ethic was resurrected among German workers in secularized form. The Gotha program already bears traces of this confusion, defining labor as the source of all wealth and all culture. Smelling a rat, Marx countered that the man who possesses no other property than his labor power must of necessity become the slave of other men who have made themselves owners. Yet the confusion spread, and soon thereafter Joseph Dietzken proclaimed, quote, "The savior of modern times is called work. Perfecting of the labor process constitutes the wealth which can now do what no redeemer has ever been able to accomplish." Close quote. The vulgar Marxist conception of the nature of labor scarcely considers the question of how its products could ever benefit the workers when they are beyond the means of those workers. It recognizes only the progress in mastering nature, not the retrogression of society. Okay, so what we have in capitalism is progress in technology, but retrogression of society. Or regression of society. It already displays the technocratic features that later emerge in fascism. Among these is a conception of nature which differs ominously from the one advocated by socialist utopias prior to the revolution of 1848. The new conception of labor is tantamount to the exploitation of nature, which, with naive complacency, is contrasted with the exploitation of the proletariat. Compared to this positivistic view, Charles Fourier's utopian socialist fantasies, which have so often been ridiculed, prove surprisingly sound. According to Fourier, cooperative labor would increase efficiency to such an extent that 4 moons would illuminate the sky at night. The polar ice caps would recede, seawater would no longer taste salty, and beasts of prey would do man's bidding. All this illustrates a kind of labor which, far from exploiting nature, would help her give birth to the creations that now lie dormant in her womb. The sort of nature that, as Dietzken puts it, exists gratis, is a complement to the corrupted conception of labor. Now, I think that we in the class looked to the planetarium. Did we have present to the planetarium? Yes. About technology being the mastery of nature. And Benjamin says, no, it's not the mastery of nature, it's the mastery of the relationship to nature. And he compares it with the idea that education is about the mastery of children rather than truly what it is, which is the mastery of the relation between generations. So the same thought occurs here. We need history, he quotes Nietzsche, but our need for it differs from that of the jaded idlers in the garden of knowledge. Here's Benjamin. The subject of historical knowledge is the struggling oppressed class itself. Marx presented as the last enslaved class, the avenger that completes the task of liberation in the name of generations of the downtrodden. This conviction, which had a brief resurgence in the Spartacus League, that's Rosa Luxemburg's organization, has always been objectionable to social democrats. Within 3 decades, they managed to erase the name of Blanqui almost entirely, though at the sound of that name, the preceding century had quaked. So we read last time the Phantasmagoria with Blanqui. The Social Democrats preferred to cast the working class in the role of a redeemer of future generations, in this way cutting the sinews of its greatest strength. This indoctrination made the working class forget both its hatred and its spirit of sacrifice, for both are nourished by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than by the ideal of liberated grandchildren. So of course you need both. Right, so you need the sense of striving for a free future, but you also need the sense of redeeming the struggle of the past. And then he quotes Joseph Dietzken again, every day our cause becomes clearer and people get smarter. Of course that's not true. Of course, people do not get smarter, they get stupider, and our cause becomes not clearer, but more confused and obscure. And we can definitely say that in 2025, for real. But this is already clear in 1940. Social democratic theory, and to an even greater extent its practice, were shaped by a conception of progress which bore little relation to reality, but made dogmatic claims. Progress, as pictured in the minds of the social democrats, was first of all progress of humankind itself, and not just advances in human ability and knowledge. Second, it was something boundless, in keeping with an infinite perfectibility of humanity. Third, it was considered inevitable, something that automatically pursued a straight or spiral course. Each of these assumptions is controversial and open to criticism. When the chips are down, criticism must penetrate beyond these assumptions and focus on what they have in common. The concept of mankind's historical progress cannot be sundered from the concept of its progression through a homogeneous, empty time. A critique of the concept of such a progression must underlie any criticism of the concept of progress itself. Okay, so what we're going to find is the opposite of homogeneous, empty time is not heterogeneous time. It's not. This is another kind of postmodernist misapprehension. It's not heterogeneous time. It's homogeneous full time as opposed to homogeneous empty time. Namely, it's homogeneous time but redeemed. He quotes Karl Kraus, origin is the goal. And then Benjamin writes, history is the subject of a construction whose site is not homogeneous empty time, but time filled full by now time, the yet site. Thus to Robespierre, ancient Rome was a past charged with now time, a past which he blasted out of the continuum of history. The French Revolution viewed itself as Rome reincarnate. It cited Rome the way fashion cites a bygone mode of dress. Fashion has a nose for the topical, no matter where it stirs in the thickets of long ago. It is the tiger's leap into the past. Such a leap, however, takes place in an arena where the ruling class gives the commands. The same leap in the open air of history is the dialectical leap Marx understood as revolution. So we have two different kinds of leaps into the past. One is the one in which affirms the status quo, and the other is the one that might transform it or revolutionize it. He writes, what characterizes revolutionary classes at their moment of action is the awareness that they are about to make the continuum of history explode. The Great Revolution introduced a new calendar. The initial day of the calendar presents history in time-lapse mode, and basically it is the same day that keeps recurring in the guise of holidays, which are days of remembrance. Thus, calendars do not measure time the way clocks do. They are monuments of the historical consciousness of which not the slightest trace has been apparent in Europe, it would seem, for the past 100 years. In the July Revolution, that's the 1830 Revolution, an incident occurred in which this consciousness came into its own. On the first evening of fighting, it so happened that the dials on clock towers were being fired at simultaneously and independently from several locations in Paris. An eyewitness who may have owed his insight to the rhyme wrote as follows. Who would believe it? It is said that incensed at the hour, latter-day Joshuas at the foot of every clock tower were firing on clock faces to make the day stand still. So, blasting the continuity of time, stopping time. That's the attempt. Now, in the Paralipomena, in the unintegrated aphorisms for this piece, he has another expression that people will often cite, which is that Marx understood revolution as the locomotive of history, but what if it is humanity pulling the brakes on the locomotive of history? Now again, of course it's both, meaning it is two simultaneous things, contradictory things, but simultaneous things. The historical materialist cannot do without the notion of a present, which is not a transition, but in which time takes a stand and has come to a standstill. For this notion defines the very present in which he himself is writing history. Historicism offers the eternal image of the past, so it fixes the past. Historical materialism supplies a unique experience with the past. The historical materialist leaves it to others to be drained by the horror called Once Upon a Time in historicism's bordello. He remains in control of his powers, man enough to blast open the continuum of history. A little bit of sexism there, but that's okay. A little bit of masculinism there, that's okay. Historicism rightly culminates in universal history. It may be that materialist historiography differs in method more clearly from universal history than from any other kind. Universal history has no theoretical armature. Its procedure is additive. It musters a mass of data to fill the homogeneous empty time. Materialist historiography, on the other hand, is based on a constructive principle. Thinking involves not only the movement of thoughts, but their arrest as well. Where thinking suddenly comes to a stop in a constellation saturated with tensions, it gives that constellation a shock, by which thinking is crystallized as a monad. The historical materialist approaches a historical object only when it confronts him as a monad. In this structure, he recognizes the sign of a messianic arrest of happening, or to put it differently, a revolutionary chance in the fight for the oppressed past. He takes cognizance of it in order to blast a specific era out of the homogeneous course of history. Thus, he blasts a specific life out of the era, a specific work out of the life work. As a result of this method, the life work is both preserved and sublated in the work, the era in the life work, and the entire course of history in the era. The nourishing fruit of what is historically understood contains time in its interior as a precious but tasteless seed. So the monad, I don't know if we talked about the monad before, I don't know if we have. So the idea, this is a Leibniz philosophical concept. The idea that every atom of God's creation is itself a complete creation. So it's about the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm. So Benjamin is saying that the point is to, in reading history against the grain, is to take each particular moment and treat it as if it were the totality. And so to sort of universalize the particular in a way that's different from the aggregate accumulation that universal history normally does. In relation to the history of all organic life on Earth, writes a modern biologist, the paltry 50 millennia history of Homo sapiens equates to something like 2 seconds at the close of a 24-hour day. On this scale, the history of civilized mankind would make up 1/5 of the last second of the last hour. now time, which as a model of messianic time comprises the entire history of mankind in a tremendous abbreviation, coincides exactly with the figure which the history of mankind describes in the universe. Historicism contents itself with establishing a causal nexus among various moments in history, but no state of affairs having causal significance is for that very reason historical. It became historical posthumously, as it were, through events that may be separated from it by thousands of years. The historian who proceeds from this consideration ceases to tell the sequence of events like beads of a rosary. He grasps the constellation into which his own era has entered, along with a very specific earlier one. Thus he establishes a conception of the present as now time shot through with splinters of messianic time. This is the nonlinear view of history that he's offering. The soothsayers who queried time and learned what it had in store certainly did not experience it as either homogeneous or empty. Whoever keeps this in mind will perhaps get an idea of how past times were experienced in remembrance, namely in just this way. We know that the Jews were prohibited from inquiring into the future. The Torah and the prayers instructed them in remembrance. This disenchanted the future, which holds sway over all those who turn to soothsayers for enlightenment. This does not imply, however, that for the Jews the future became homogeneous empty time. For every second was a small gateway in time through which the Messiah might enter. So again, homogeneous full time. Every second became a small gateway in time through which the Messiah might enter. So homogeneous in that sense. Shot through with splinters of messianic time, potentially full with redemption. It's a kind of an obscure text, but nonetheless, what he's arguing for is, could be put in kind of simple terms. It's against automatic progress, against the assumption or faith or belief in automatic progress, assuming an objective progress of history. So he's arguing against that. And he's arguing for a freedom to relate to the past out of its continuity with the present. So trying to break with that chain of events, continuity of time model of historicism that simultaneously tries to keep each moment of the past in itself as objective knowledge, but rather this active constructed relationship with the past from the standpoint of the present. So to break the conformism of the present, one has to break the way that the present conforms with the past. And the way the past conforms to itself in a kind of continuity of time. So reading history against the grain, looking at past moments in history as full of an unfulfilled potential, that also speaks to the unfulfilled potential of the present. And trying to redeem that potential of the past. That redeeming the past is inseparable from redeeming the present. So no faith in a better future. No faith in the present as somehow having made progress over the past. We'll see what the postmodernists do with it. One thing that we had in the reading for this week that we didn't talk about today was the Nietzsche, the Foucault. Foucault's piece, Nietzsche, Genealogy, History. So we may or may not come back to that. We're going to be reading Foucault in a couple of weeks. But the punchline of that essay is that he admires Nietzsche, but he criticizes Nietzsche for still believing in freedom. Whereas, of course, for Benjamin, that's the entire point of Nietzsche. Again, it's the entire point of critical history. All right. Have a good weekend. Take good care, and I'll see you guys next week.